there's a version of what it means to be African that, can imply staying within prescribed epistemic boundaries. And so that's a discourse, kind of intellectual xenophobia, right? You're always worried about contamination, and you're always trying to purge foreign influences. And I think so I'm not necessarily saying that that's what was happening post Rhodes Must Fall, as universities were trying to reconstitute themselves. But I was noticing that, there are, in different domains, there is this contestation over the boundaries of an African, or what it means to belong in an African university.
I'm German. Hello, Michael.
Anye.
Next up is Nyamnjoh. Anye did his PhD on formalism and knowledge production.
So I'm actually experimenting in this context. So thanks to George for the opportunity and the willingness to maybe take the conversation, or at least see how it possibly travels in a different direction, different context. First of all, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for making the time. Thanks to George for putting this together, and thanks to the other contributors who made this a vibrant conversation. It's good to be a part of, yeah. I want to make a link, a very serpentine link, between the chapter I contributed and my current interests and work in the ethics of emerging technologies, so specifically AI ethics. And at a general level, when it comes to thinking about the ethics of artificial intelligence, conversations about decolonization, there's an easy entry point. You can think about the ways in which colonial or imperial dependencies and exploitations are mediated by artificial intelligence and AI infrastructures, in terms of the location of who owns these technologies. And so, much like in the post-colonial period, decolonization meant political sovereignty, and in its neo-colonial articulations, or at least in the neo-colonial context, it meant economic sovereignty. Today's conversations, you can see the invocation of decolonization to talk about a kind of technological sovereignty. And so what would an African technological sovereignty mean in a digital age? So I know that's already a bit left field, but maybe I'll start talking about the chapter, my contribution, and then sort of what I think those connections are. So I was working with, or at least I was thinking through, a very specific conception of decolonization. Also a very intuitive one, We're digging where we stand. I was a student during Rhodes Must Fall and Fees Must Fall, and it shaped my intellectual trajectory quite profoundly in terms of, the kinds of things that I was engaging in and the kind of conversation that I wanted to be a part of. And the one intuitive language of decolonization, digging where we stand in the African context, is Africanization. If you want to decolonize, you make things more African, because what was colonialism but a kind of denationalization or an undermining of Africanness. And so I was interested in, what are the limits of grounding decolonization in the politics of Africanness. And at least I advanced that conversation through a particular conceptual framework that allows me to effectively say that, or to give it's not a new interpretation, it's just a different emphasis. And the emphasis here is decolonization is a politics of belonging. Where that comes from, so I'll explain what that means in a moment, but where that comes from is a frustration, not a frustration, it's just a different articulation of what's at stake. So in that moment, in the immediate aftermath of protests, and sort of as the different university communities are looking to reconstitute themselves, you wouldn't be wrong in thinking that decolonization was something, it's limited to matters of curriculum and pedagogy, what we teach, how we teach. And so you'd be forgiven to think that that's where the core stake is located. So in saying that decolonization is a politics of belonging, I'm just trying to articulate a different kind of stake. And by politics of belonging, I'm talking about a dynamic process in which we generate norms and ethical values by which we judge not only our membership in a particular community, but the membership of others. So you can kind of see it as the dirty work. Sometimes, it's not always, it's the dirty work of boundary maintenance. So we articulate, revise, and ultimately contest boundaries. So when you talk about making a university more African, you're going to end up in this process of boundaring Africanness as an intellectual identity. And so that's the kind of conversation that I saw. So when I think about decolonization in historical perspective, and even in the South African, so the post-Rhodes Must Fall context, I'm seeing it as an evolving conversation about what it means to be intellectually African, both in the sense of who is the African for whom representation is sought, and then the resulting ethical commitments of how you sort of demonstrate that Africanness. And I resonate a lot with George's concept of epistemic ethno-nationalism, because at the very least it reflects an undercurrent that African political thinkers and African intellectuals have been resisting, which is the idea that, in reconstituting a damaged sense of African selfhood, commits you to insularity, to enclosure. And I think historically, some of the figures you quoted in that broader genealogy, like Ontonji, but also, Suleiman Dian, all of them see the task of decolonization as a kind of transcultural communication, where it's important that African thinkers, African philosophers are not imprisoned are not made prisoners of identity-based prescriptions. So, when you talk about a mapping of the world in which, every group, every nation, every cultural grouping, or every race has their own epistemic framework that cannot be judged by external standards, so that relativist moral geography that we're talking about. But even the idea that, you shouldn't go outside of, or you should employ knowledge or beliefs or concepts that are appropriate to that moral geography. So there's a version of what it means to be African that, can imply staying within prescribed epistemic boundaries. And so that's a discourse, kind of intellectual xenophobia, right? You're always worried about contamination, and you're always trying to purge foreign influences. And I think so I'm not necessarily saying that that's what was happening post-Rhodes Must Fall, as universities were trying to reconstitute themselves. But I was noticing that, there are, in different domains, there is this contestation over the boundaries of an or what it means to belong in an African university. And I discuss examples across language. So, for example, is Afrikaans an African language? To the extent that it's, and the way in which that takes place at historically Afrikaans medium universities. Recruitment, we may talk about a Pan-African curriculum, but when it comes to deciding who is going to teach that African curriculum, what is the extent to which Africanization becomes South Africanization of the university? And even within that idea of South Africanization, what is the extent to which there are hierarchies of Africans, right, in that category, in that schema? And I also think about how these questions of belonging are articulated in the domain of knowledge production by looking at an attempt to Africanize African history. So African history was dominated by colonial historiography. And then in the post-independence period, you have all these efforts to vindicate the African past, right? To inscribe the African factor in African history, show that Africans are conscious shapers and, or at least history in Africa has an endogenous development to it, and it's not just external actors who are the engines of history. And the politics of belonging, I noticed there is a critique, right, about who ought. So when you have the nationalist attempt to decolonize or Africanize history, who is the African that attempt is speaking to? So you have the Marxist critique that says that had no relevance to African working class, African proletariat, or African peasantry. And so there was an attempt to almost inscribe a particular vision of, so you have this African community, and so the critique is that this is actually an elitist history, and what you need to stake a claim for the working class and peasantry as members of that African intellectual community that historians have to speak to. So their belong to a community is about whether or not you are the audience of historical knowledge about Africa. So where did it all go wrong? How did I make this left field move now to the ethics of technology? And there are two entry points, I think. So I've articulated this politics of belonging largely through the language of Africanization. So the question there is, well, where do we see calls for Africanization in AI ethics? And I think there's two entry points. One is, conversations about epistemic justice travel. They are not just humanistic concerns. So AI ethics is a field of inquiry. So naturally, you will ask questions like, who gets to produce authoritative knowledge about ethics? How does power shape the production of our assumptions about who can produce authoritative knowledge and where it comes from? Are we drawing on the diversity of global intellectual heritages in the production of knowledge? And so their Africanization, the entry point is a lamentation of Africa's marginal position in the global discourse of science and innovation. Another entry point is what's referred to as the alignment problem. So with all this talk about artificial intelligence becoming more autonomous, that's juxtaposed against a loss of human control. And so you have this question, how will we align artificial intelligence at a normative level with human values, human interests? So if you recognize reasonable plurality, then there's a question of, well, there are African values, so how do we make sure artificial intelligence aligns with African values? So that's the normative account of alignment. There's also the technical part about how will you exactly encode. And so I guess right now I'm interested in a different kind of boundary work, right? So if there is this demand for an inscription of Africanness to make sure that AI is suited to the local context, to the African context, how do we draw boundaries along that context? What counts as an African idea? What are the sorts of concepts, beliefs, orientations that get visibility, and what are their ethical implications? So I kind of want to talk about, I guess, two different ways in which that image of the continent is carved up. One is, Africa as a place of scarcity, Africa as a place of lack, right? And so that's the context. That's lack and scarcity form the contours of this context that needs to be inscribed in global conversations about AI ethics. And so ultimately that tends to lead you to particular kind of ethical conversations, right? Distributive justice. Can we make sure that everyone has access to these technologies? Another kind of boundary work is the African imaginary, or the imaginary of Africa as a collectivist, communitarian, relational, discursive space. And so often the key idea that gets a lot of airtime is ubuntu. So you'll find desire to sort of think about what AI ethics means from an Ubuntu perspective. Sometimes that influences governance conversations about, individualist versus relational versus group privacy. Sometimes you can extend that, Africans are communitarian, Westerners are individualists. You can extend it to a kind of anti-capitalist critique. But I mean, just a loose commentary on that, on those conversations is that I actually don't think that Ubuntu has a sufficiently materialist conception of reality to be able to make those kinds of critiques. But I guess the connection that I'm trying to make is just really around who or what ends up representing Africanness in spaces of inclusion. And do we sometimes notice a deference epistemology? Deference not just to certain people as absolute representatives, but also certain ideas. What gets included, what gets left out, and what are the limitations of that? And that's another area that would be contested, right? So for example, one kind of contestation that I'm trying to do is that Ubuntu is not the only African idea. Africa has a rich history of anti-colonial, anti-imperial, as just an example, traditions. And so it's very surprising that the African Union will produce a continental strategy on artificial intelligence, and we're talking about an African renaissance, that AI fomenting a cultural renaissance, but not linking that to all the alternative imaginaries of what a renaissance looked like. The only thing they talk about is Ubuntu, and it's linked to peace and prosperity on the continent. Do we narrow the canvas on which African ideas are painted? Do we make African scholars prisoners of identity-based prescriptions? So if there is a global demand for Africanness, for epistemic justice, for in these conversations of alignment, what do African scholars feel like they can legitimately contribute to those conversations? I think those are the different ways in which I think one's membership in a particular political community, and in this case I'm describing African as a political community because it's contesting configurations of power, can itself also be a terrain of contestation where we're generating all these values about who and what is African. So I think that's looking forward to your thoughts on the conversation that I tried to highlight in the chapter, but also the fluid directions in which I've taken it in.
Thank you very much. One of the functions of describing a chapter is to intrigue us, so we go and read it. I'm intrigued.